Kia ora everyone and aloha. I'm going to introduce Lisa by way of a whakatauki from where Lisa is from. Lisa's from the top of the North Island, and there's a very well used verse that comes out of Te Tai Tokero that my uncle, in fact, Arnold Wilson, would use frequently. He married one of Lisa's relatives, and so it became part of my family's knowledge of the North. And after I sing Lisa Reihana, then Moana Nepia, who's a professor at Mānua, will be in conversation with Lisa, and they are very good friends and go back a very long way. And so I want to keep it that informal because they have so much to share with you. And mō reira Lisa, koe nei te koha mo tēnei pō kia koe. Nō reira. That's my introduction. Hutia te rito te harakeke, kai hea te komako e ko, ki mai ki a hau e, he aha te mea nui o te ao, maku e ki atu e, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata e. The bellbird is a beautiful singing bird, and where Lisa comes from, the sound is tremendously loved by the people. When you hear this bird singing, you know you are in some way special. And the whakatauki also asks if we deplete our resources. The bellbird only eats a particular type of flower. That's what it thrives on. And so if this plant and its flower disappears, that actually says something about our human impact on the environment, as well as the question, what do we value in the world? What is the thing we most value? And Lisa's ancestors would say, it is people, it is people, it is people. Nō reira, moana, koe nei tō wāhana hei whakanui a Lisa. Tēnā koe.
Kia ora koe ngahi raka, e rauranga tira mā, e whoma, e mihi kau atu ana rā kia koutou. It's a real privilege to be here at the Bishop Museum today with so many connections to home, for us, at home in Aotearoa, New Zealand. To see that connection rekindled in ways that are creative as well as scholarly. Yeah? We have artists, architects, anthropologists coming through this institution periodically. And this work that Lisa has is very special because in part it responds to taonga in this museum and in other museums around the globe. But firstly, I think that Lisa would like us all to see the video, that not in as it's designed to be seen as an installation across the way, but here in this space on the screen, before we talk about the work. Is that right? Yeah. So could we flip the lights off, please? And is there anything you'd like to say beforehand, Lisa?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you to Enigmatic and Marcus. Thank you for that beautiful welcome. And to all of you for giving up your afternoon, giving up choice So wonderful to be here at the Honolulu Biennial. It's a real honour to be on this whenua, on this land. And what I thought would be useful is to show the video first, because we're going to kind of talk around it. It's 14 minutes long. Looks at a whole series of ideas based around Pacific mourning practices, and the work is being repurposed and designed for the Pacific Hall, and will be on view from Wednesday the 8th. So this is kind of a special sneak preview for everybody here, and we'll come back and talk about that afterwards. So please relax, don't get scared. Oh, I have to imagine it without the sound that's happening outside.
Lisa's had a long and very distinguished career as a photographer and a video artist. In many ways, a pioneer in the art scene in New Zealand for Māori visual artists and for Māori women artists too. And it's been interesting to see her work over the years. She's represented New Zealand overseas at many international arts festivals, including the Asia Pacific Triennale in Queensland. And this year has work going into the Venice Biennale later this year, in Pursuit of Venus Infected, which is another large work, 5 projections across 23 metres, is it, of video screen, larger than life. And it's, we'll talk about that a bit later. But each of the works that she's done, she's explored different technical elements of video making and installation. When talking to some of my students at the university here, and we try and come to some understanding about artworks, I use the term hurihuritanga, a Māori concept that involves turning ideas over in your mind, turning things around to consider them from different perspectives, and also repositioning ourselves to consider and look at or understand things differently. And so in this conversation today, I hope we're going to touch on some of the many different ways in which we might do that with Lisa's work. We're so privileged to have her here as the artist, so we get some inside information about her intention. We can also have our own experience to what we've just seen here, but that's quite different, as I mentioned, to how the work might be envisaged as an installation. And Lisa will talk about some of those things as well. Hopefully we'll get some insight into the process of making the video, what was going on with the cameraman, with the sound engineer, with the actors, and one of who was here and is now on her way to New York, Rosanna Raymond, who played Enigmatic in this piece, shared some insight in that process. So it would be lovely to hear you talking about that too, Lisa. As well as putting us into the bigger picture about your mahi, your work, yeah, how this work fits into that concept. And that bigger context, sorry. So if there are different kind of perspectives that we might adopt in this conversation, I'm hoping that we can sort of address some of them, and then we invite you to ask questions at the end. But firstly, Lisa, the name, Tai Whetuki. It took me a while. I was doing a little bit of research about this notion of Whetuki, which can mean a tremor, a trembling, a traumatic event, can in some way invite us to make associations with content. Yeah? But it was from a particular piece of research that you came to use that name. Would you like to tell us a bit about that story, please?
Sure. This is, thanks, Moana. It's got a lovely, catchy little name, which is Tai Whetuki, House of Death. And when I was commissioned originally to make this for the Auckland Arts Festival in 2015, which was the same time I was working on In Pursuit of Venus. And I will talk a little bit about In Pursuit of Venus because this project's come out of that. And it's a larger project that will be coming to Hawaii in 2018, so I'll be able to share that with you at that point in time. But the work In Pursuit of Venus looks at a whole lot of events and interactions based around Captain Cook's explorations of the Pacific. And of course, he met his demise here in Hawaii, and I knew that that was something that I would need to include in the work, and in fact it's one of the reasons I was inspired to make the work. And I felt in my research that I wanted to not just show Captain Cook's death, because some people say it's heroic, or he was really stupid, or there's so many different ways of reading that event. But what I wanted to match it up was to show the way that Pacific people might think about or honour and deal in this area of death. And then when I started looking at death instantly means you have to be alive in order to have a death. And so I started to look at that birth-death process. And I was reading a lot about people who had near-death experiences and how oftentimes they talk about moving towards the light. And I thought, well, that's actually what a baby does when it's been born into the world, is move towards the light and into the world. So there's a lot of ideas and concepts, and it's a very experimental work in a way, which is driven by the fact that I'm not a te reo speaker of Māori, my own language, so the way that I work through a lot of my work is about a feeling and trying to convey some concepts and ideas that I know a little bit about or I'm researching about and putting them out there into the world visually. Tai Whetuki House of Death is a term that I found through my research of Alston Best, and so it's not from my tribal homelands in a sense, the inspiration for that, but I wanted to find some Māori terminology to sit with the title of the project, because I think it indicates something and it becomes a doorway, a signal, as you said. And that idea of the traumatic event, I only found out after you wrote to me, and I think that actually being born into this world can be a traumatic event. And there's a scene where there's a rope moving through some water, and it's in a way thinking about amniotic fluid, when people pass away, how hard it is to give up that last breath, the breath of life. And I was very, very much inspired to make this work because I was thinking about my own father has not been so well over the last 6 or 7 years, and my sisters and I have been looking after him. The other thing that I was really interested in is where gender, what are the roles that sit around this process, who are the men and who are the women. And thinking about Hine Nui Te Po, who's a very, I've looked at her a lot and thought about her a lot. She's called the goddess of death, which is quite a tough term to come to terms with. But I also think about the return, that she is, there's this feminine principle that welcomes you back as you're departing this world. And I wanted to give her that sense of that all-important feminine principle that takes you over that moment and over that time. And in a way, with the welcome ceremony and that way that the voice can open up a space in between, and where do male and female roles fit in there. So I'm trying to evoke a whole series of feelings within the work. I think I've rambled completely, of course, but looking at looking at all cultures and all humanities around the world, there is this idea of crossing the river, the river Styx. And where I come from in the far north, there is a tree from which you depart this earth and you go back to Hawaii. And that water is a really important idea that actually flows through many, many different cultures. So it's a way of visually trying to talk about a particular place, but that is also a very general idea across many, many cultures. So I'm always trying to find ways to invite people in, different clues into ways that they might think about what the work is about, even though it's seemingly experimental. You have these quite strong ideas through there. And then also, not only is there Hinenui Te Po at the gate, there's Te Ku Watawata, who's the very strange figure at the end. And I thought of him, if he's in a cave and underground, that he would be very pale. And so it starts to think about some other our mythological stories and how we imagine what those places are. And also I have to say that I started watching American Horror Story. I mean, I'm an avid watcher of all sorts. I love science fiction and I watch a lot of video material, and I wanted to get in there and play around with some really high-end cameras. This is shot on a Red camera in a 6K space, and whilst working on In Pursuit of Venus, I was really stuck inside a kind of illustrated space, and I wanted to break that out and take people into a more primordial landscape. And the landscape in which it's shot is Karikari, which is on the west coast of Auckland, and the place where we recorded was a site of a massacre where some of my people came down, and so it's a very loaded space. So it was it's you have to take a lot of things on if you're going to start exploring this type of territory, and to try and be culturally safe for myself, for the people that I work with, the places that it's going into, etc. So one of the things at the end of the film, I wanted to inbuild this idea of clearing the space as well. So there's a very beautiful feather, and actually Rosanna, it's this idea of, because I didn't want to, at home you would use water to clear yourself of any spirits, you're not carrying anything untoward in your body away. So I wanted to embed that into the film, so anyone who's watching it, there is that sense of cultural safety. So it's something that I think about a lot, and that has its own interesting conversations as well. So those are a lot of the things that happen in the background that most people don't know about, but that negotiation. We talked to the local tribe from Karikari so that they knew what we were doing. We talked about the project and made sure that it was safe for us to go before we even went onto that whenua, onto that land. So there's a whole lot of stuff that might happen in the background. It's got nothing to do with the technology, but certainly cultural protocols and thinking through those aspects.
Thank you. Yeah, just when reading Elson Best's account of some stories he got from Te Ngātarangoa, one of our 19th century, and who was a Māori tohunga in the 19th century, an orator, scholar, he relayed stories about Kupe, one of our famous navigator ancestors in Aotearoa, who is depicted in different stories in different tribal groups. But in one of those stories, his daughter Punaruku was killed, and the phrase used to refer to her being taken off into another life was with reference to this idea of Tai Whetuki, which she terms the house of death. But interestingly, Kupe is one of our ancestors for whom we have stories that connect us to Hawaii, to Rarotonga, to Raiatea in French Polynesia. So it ties in with the sort of connections that Lisa's making also in the work when using material from other parts of the Pacific. And I'm wondering if perhaps you can develop or share some information about how you've been doing that. Yeah.
What do you mean?
Working with the different cultural material and artefacts from different parts of the Pacific, in Pursuit of Venus and in this work too. Yeah.
Well, oftentimes I come to places like the Bishop and I want to scoop everything up and take it home and deposit it back to those places from whence it came. As much as we'd like to do that, I love museums. I love that they are treasure houses and that they are places that, well, for me, it's like my church in a way. And being in the Pacific Hall, this work will go into the Pacific Hall, which is an incredible honour for me. I mean, it's one thing to be in an art gallery, you know, the white square, clean white square space, but then to go into the museums when you're actually having to deal with other taonga, or I hate the word artefacts because it makes them feel very dislocated from the people who made them and imbue them with the mana that they have. So I travel around the world. I go to a really fantastic film festival called Imaginative, and that happens in Toronto. And so I spend a lot of time with Canadian Indians, First Nations people in that arena. And so the reference to them is in the feather that's used at the end of the clearing of that space. The marks on the body are actually a reference to Aboriginal body painting, because it has that kind of skeletal look, and I thought that was a really, you know, so it's a bit of a mashup. So in some ways that could be frowned upon, but in some ways I'm kind of like, I'm very interested in how we do connect people together, and this idea of bringing people together. It's something that I attempt to do in my work. And I try to do it, I try to tread lightly and in the best way that I can. And that's difficult because you can't ask everybody's permission in a way. And then sometimes if I feel like I'm, for instance, in Pursuit of Venus, there's a scene that I look forward to having some conversations with some people from Nootka Sound, because I really wanted to work with some descendants of Nootka Sound, but couldn't afford to do that. And my decision was to include the scene and deal with the consequences afterwards, and see that as an opportunity to create conversations and networks. But the main reason for including it is if you don't have that material there, it's like there's a conversation or someone is, it's another erasure. And I think it's better to be present and use that as a way of creating new networks and new relationships and come to new understandings rather than not including it. So that's a decision that I've made, and that's kind of a tough, it does have its own issues, I think, so it'll be interesting to hear back from others about that choice. But it is a choice that I've decided to take, because just through my discussions with various people and just testing my theories, it's like oftentimes Maori actors play Mexicans, if you know what I mean. So we kind of crossing cultures, and what I find more and more is that many people from the Pacific have multiple bloodlines, and so it's become quite a blended mix.
Part of the interest in this work being shown here is that it's to be shown in close proximity to an example of the Hewa Tupapo, the Tahitian chief mourner's costume, which has its own story. And you've also were part of the making of the one used in the filming of these two works that are both being shown this year. Can you talk to us about how you feel about that connection here and the process of making this?
It's really interesting. So when I, with the Cook material and showing his death, I felt like actually it's at that time that he was discovering the various islands that our traditional practices were disappearing, and one of those was the use of the chief mourner costume after a chief had passed away. And so I wanted to include that. I mean, it's a very spectacular garment, but it is a garment, and I really wanted to understand. I was reading a lot of accounts about banks taking part in a killing spree with one of the chief mourners in Tahiti, and I found that fascinating because it was Joseph Banks blacking up in terms of an Englishman going native and agreeing to sort of transgress that moment. And I thought that if I could recreate that scene, just to see what it's played out, because often we're going to museums and you would never see it on a body, you don't even see what it looks like moving around. So it took me about 2 years to be able to make that costume because I'd never actually seen one. I never saw one until after I made this work. But what we did is a worldwide search, and we talked to the various museums who have them in their collections, and the bishop lent the Heva Tupapaku, I would say. Yeah. And so there was a little a set of hand-drawn instructions on how to present it. And so what I could see from that was the various layers that made up the full costume. So I went about making it based on this kind of instructions on how to display it. And that's how I went about doing that. It was really interesting. Then once I worked with the actors, and we were talking about cultural practice and what does it mean? What does it mean when he goes out into the world and would be in the morning and in the evenings, and talking about that kind of radiance, because the thing about darkness is light shines out in the darkness, and that's something really particular to this costume too. The way that the mask, wearing a mask that's white, and that it's made of mother of pearl, and the way that light will flash off of it, and so how it would engender fear in the people that saw it. So I've always been interested in the dark and the light aspects. I often do a series of black works, and then I'll follow that by a series of white works, and vice versa. I keep tripping between the two of those. And In Pursuit of Venus is set at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and this is set in the evening. So I wanted to just see what those two different things happened, because it's almost like a cartoon in Pursuit of Venus, because it's so bright, and there's a whole lot of lovely things happening, but actually there's a whole other subtext that's going on. And one of them is people go, wow, I want to make a great costume. Yeah, look what's happening. And what is this thing? So I wanted to put that out there into the world and see what would come back. And what I've found since the time of creating the costume is people have been sending me information, little snippets, little bits and pieces about how they understand how it works. And I'm working with the British Museum at the moment, who also have a costume, and I've written a short article piece for them, because we're trying to embarrass the British Museum into conserving that particular costume, because it's not been looked at and looked after properly. And so it's quite interesting to make something, because you draw focus to it, and you create an energy around it. And since making this work, and if I go and do like a Google search, just as a very crude way of looking at how much information is popping up, there's more and more coming up. So it seems to have, it's created its own energy.
Can you tell us what it's like working in the field with your actors, with your team of collaborators, all the technical assistants that you have? How did you work with the actors in this piece, considering the nature of the work? The subject matter is tapu, has an element of the sacred to it, and I'm wondering how you developed that relationship with the actors and are able to come up with the play? Do you work with a storyboard? Do you work with improvisation? How do you develop material with your actors?
So a lot of it's just been really my research and reading all these odd little accounts of things that have happened, distilling them down into a series of what it might potentially look like, and then we kind of made it up in the field in a sense. But just winding back from that, what I'd like to say is what we would do is I spend quite a lot of time organising, getting the permissions, deciding on a look, doing some tests. We had a really particular way that we shot that to make it look like it's in the evening, in this kind of unearthly glow. But we would start with a blessing to make sure that everyone's safe before we begin the process. And then what we did is we humped in hundreds of kilos of camera gear, and we went with the smallest possible crew that we could. So there was the 3 actors. I brought my nephew on board. I always work with my family. I always like to have one of them close by, and we used him as what you call a runner. So he was running backwards and forwards between the van and just doing a whole lot of learning, really, being around the camera. And then there was 3 camera guys, myself and my partner James, who did the soundtrack. We already looked at the sites of where we would shoot the various shots, and it's actually within quite a small area. And then we just had to carry it. There was someone who did makeup as well. So it was that's quite a small group. So we had to run backwards and forwards a lot, just carrying camera gear. And the next day we decided not to carry so much camera gear because we would have really sore legs and sore muscles. We could only afford to shoot for 2 days. And it was the first time for me really going out into the West Coast. And the West Coast is a notoriously hard place to shoot in. It's very windy, it rains. So we had, and the red camera is basically like a computer without a skin on it and just a bunch of lenses out the front. So every time the rain would come over, everyone would cover the camera and we would stand around getting wet and just waiting for the rain to pass by.
Yeah, just for those of you who don't know, Karikaria Beach on the west coast of the North Island of New Zealand is probably less than an hour from the downtown area. But it was also where the film The Piano, Jane Campion's Oscar-winning film, was shot. So it's iconic in many ways, but also as a set location, and the weather only enhances this, what some people have described as a gothic, moody kind of landscape that has been exploited by so many different filmmakers in New Zealand. And so these saturated blues, greens, dark, deep shadows help create mood in a lot of our films from New Zealand. Can you tell us a bit about the soundtrack? We have James here, well, maybe James would like to tell us how that evolved.
Kia ora, everyone. Hauled up on stage. The soundtrack, well, as Lisa said, we watch an enormous amount of American TV, mostly don't we? So, the new stuff that's coming out from various different great directors like the Nick, which is Soderbergh's new work. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but it's a really amazing piece. And that really inspired this soundtrack. That one was slightly out of sync, I'm sorry, but we've been watching the Nick and a couple of other ones that were sort of set in the late 1800s. And one in particular had this very synthetic soundtrack, which is not really what you would associate with that time frame, but we talked a lot about it and wanted to put something kind of quite synthetic and not ethnographic in an obvious way, because this is set in such an unusual, for me it was a dreamscape, a very surreal kind of beautiful dreamscape that Lisa had created. So we just started playing around with a whole lot of new synthesizers essentially that I'd kind of been collecting. And then we did go and record some actual sounds. There are sounds in there of the cave. There's this beautiful, beautiful cave, which is very, 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 very dark and very powerful, and there are insects inside the cave, and it drips continually. And actually, Lisa and I sort of spent much of our youth at that beach. I went there many, many times as a child. I know it really intimately, and I've sort of semi-lived out there all my life. And done a lot of music making out at that beach, because there was a house out there that was very famously turned into a recording studio. And I worked out there for a long time, and my father would go out there all the time. So I just had this feeling, and I know Lisa's youth was spent a lot at that beach as well. And as Moana said, it is actually this incredibly powerful place. It's black sand, it's vast, it feels primordial, and I guess when making the sound I really wanted to try and conjure up some of that feeling, but as I said earlier, without being this very openly ethnographic or very, very pointedly trying to place it in some historical textures. It was much more for me about creating a mood, and I wanted to use electronica, to be honest, which is something I've worked in for many years. If that makes any sense to me.
It was really interesting when we were filming, because when Ed's Eramina, the Maori warrior, every time we turned the camera on, the kerelu, or the pigeons, would fly around. And when we were working around the cave, there were a lot of fantails, people. So there was a lot, every time it was like they knew it was on. We're like, oh my goodness, we wish we could record this sound too. So we were very much, the birds were with us the whole time that we were filming. And that is part of the feeling that I hope is in the work, even though you don't see them. There are some insects, etc. It's a bit hard to see on the screen. The other filmmaker that I was very interested in terms of a reference was Jean Cocteau. I love his work, and he has a particular mood and quite an experimental filmic methodology, and that's something that I wanted to insert into this. And something that a lot of filmmakers used to do in the film world is called shooting day for night, and so that's a technique that we were experimenting with to create the look that we did. So we'd spent quite a lot of time experimenting and pushing it through the computer and playing with the colour grading to get the feeling that I wanted. Because if you see the original, it's much brighter and much greener and much sunnier. But that's, I wanted it to be, people talk about the underworld, I just want it to be an otherworld, and so it's otherworldly.
Yeah, I was particularly quite in awe with the way you managed to depict the water there, this inky blue-black, which is very beautiful. Yeah. I had a question too about something that Rosanna Raymond, who's the female character in the piece, who plays two roles actually in that. As the woman who's grieving, cutting herself, which I'd like to talk a little bit about, but also as Hinenui Te Po, understood by some as the guardian or goddess of the underworld, who welcomes people back or to make that transition into the underworld. And I was saying, how did you feel about playing this role? And she said, well, actually, she didn't feel like she was Hinenui Te Po, but she was with Hinenui Te Po. So she found a way of acknowledging this character, and while also accompanying her and imagining her on a creative journey. And then I was thinking about that in relation to something that Charles Karamu Royal talks about, this idea of whakaahua, of making similarities or appearances or resemblances of things as a process. connecting with your approach, you describe making rather than taking photographs. So as a process, I'm really interested in that, and perhaps you can talk about that in this context.
Well, the process of hai, which is very Mahilaka, has a reference to that in recording. That's when I was a teacher, I had a few students who were self-harming, and I was thinking about that notion of bloodletting and what does that mean, and how do you help somebody through that process. And I was thinking about, is it because you want to feel or you can't feel? There's a number of other aspects that I think almost coming out of the skin. The bloodletting is a really a potent and a powerful process. And when I was growing up, there was that song, Only Women Bleed. I used to hate that line, Only Women Bleed. So what do they mean by Only Women Bleed? And when we went to shoot that scene, it was really interesting. I'd taken in a shell for Rosanna to use, and it just seemed too kind of contrived and large, and it just didn't suit her. She was left-handed and it didn't fit her hand properly. So I just looked around where we were, and I picked up just a tiny little shell from the space we were in, and she picked it up and just proceeded to. It did in fact, it wasn't like she was trying to do it really hard, but it immediately started bleeding. So I thought it was kind of about the power of the place and how she is and how she was in that moment. And she's a very powerful performer. I think she looks spectacular in this work. And we've known each other for a long time. We've worked together for probably 20 plus years. So we have a shorthand in terms of being able to jump through some of those hoops, whereas, and I thought Ed's was kind of amazing too as the Māori warrior. Were these other questions?
Oh, well actually, yes, it's a bit complicated, because I did actually sort of ask two or three questions there. Yeah, with regards to the idea of whakaahua, this, or let's say, comparing it to how some performers might feel they are the character they are portraying.
Yeah.
So when talking about haka, for example, this is our Māori dance. For some performers, they are Tāne Rori, they are the male ancestral figure who is credited with being the origin of haka, or the woman. A woman is Hineruhi, another ancestral figure, who's associated with the origins of dance. So that personification is more than just an appearance of something.
Yeah.
It's actually being and
yes.
Or becoming something. It's not in that way. It's very transformative, as opposed to this idea of mimicking
yes.
or acting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you?
Something my dear friend of mine, Nikki Kara, who's a filmmaker, she told me if you pick the right person, you don't have to do too much work. And in a way, in a lot of the work that I do, it's finding the right person to work with that sort of embodies those characteristics that you're looking for to express through the camera, through the film. So I often don't, in that situation, I did actually work with a trained actor. In fact, Ali is an actor as well, and Rosanna is a performance artist. So people who are very comfortable about slipping into that, but into these various roles. But if you choose the right person in the first place, in a way they do embody that idea, and so that's what I try to do. And even in the casting of this, there was a couple of other people who came and fell out, weren't available on the dates that we were going to shoot, so you have to keep moving through. So it was quite interesting how it all kind of fell into place. And I'm a firm believer in timing. I do think that the right things come at the right time. So I cast 3 other males to do that part, and then in the end he came recommended by somebody else, and then when he turned up, he was the right person. So it was really interesting because I was getting quite worried about, you set the dates for your filming and you just got to keep moving forward. And he virtually turned up 2 days before we were doing the shoot. And I'm sure a lot of filmmakers, we all have that issue because we're not working with multi-million-dollar budgets. And even if you are, it doesn't guarantee that the people that you'd like to work with are available at the time. There is a lot of issues around timing.
Okay, well, I'm sensing that time's running out. I've got one more question which I think maybe we can address quite quickly, and then I'd like to invite people to ask questions. That last question just has to do with the different iterations of the work so far, and I understand in Auckland it looked quite different, yeah, for the Auckland Arts Festival. Was it 2015?
Yes, yeah. So the first, and it kind of follows on from this idea of budgets. So I was commissioned to make a work for the Auckland Arts Festival while I was making In Pursuit of Venus. So I extracted some scenes from that and created a single channel short film. Then last year I was nominated for the Walters Art Prize, and there was a couple of scenes that I never got to shoot because of the rain. And so we went back out to Kari, and mostly I was working with Rosanna. It was her material because it kept raining every time she came out. So it actually cried a lot when she was there. So this time we've managed to record more of the female content and then redistribute the scenes across two channels or 2 videos. But in the Walters Prize, it was presented in a very, 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 very black room with a very shiny black floor and on 2 different walls. So actually what happened is the screens were like mirrors in the ground. And I used a hazing device. It's a bit like a smoke machine that you get in a disco, but this is a hazer. They use them in theatre quite a lot. And so the room that you walked into was just full of this kind of haze. So it really created the sense of being in another place and time. For Bishop, I'm presenting it like this side by side because I saw the screens that are in the Pacific Hall. And for me, I think this is an amazing museum, and I really wanted to honour it and the pieces that are here, and I knew the chief mourner costumes here, and I wanted to see them, and I thought it would be interesting for people to see them in relation to each other, to see them actually moving in the way that it shimmers, the light and how that reflects, and to remind people that all these things that are inside these cabinets have a life. And for me, that was an opportunity to bring mana back to this place, and to, I think the last time I was in Hawaii was when the cloak was returned from Te Papa. So I felt really proud that there was this opportunity of these kind of gifts returning and coming from Aotearoa to this place. And it was really in that kind of offer of a handshake I was wanting to present this work. So this is the 3rd time that I showed the work. So yeah, those are the 3 iterations.
Great, thank you very much. Would anyone like to ask a question? Can you please identify yourself?
Sure. Hello. My name is Nanette Napoleon. I'm a native Hawaiian, and this film was particularly interesting to me because I've been a long-time researcher of the topic of death and dying, not only in Hawaiian culture, but in many other cultures around the world. So, and I have to give you mahalo for bringing this more like a feature film instead of a documentary. I've seen many documentaries regarding death and dying and things, but to present it this way, I really, really, really think that this adds to the body of knowledge in this area in a way that is important to present to the general public, all of us. So then I'm watching the film and I thought, oh, this is going to be really interesting, but I got thrown back because there's no dialogue. And okay, I'm going. At first I was like, okay, how do I understand this? Because there's no dialogue. But then I just released that, And I said, okay, what do I identify? What do I see in here that I can identify with my Hawaiian culture? And there were many parallels in there, like the ritualistic cutting, and we have a lot of that ritualistic self-mutilation. And many other cultures around the world do that same thing. So I was just going with the flow and kind of letting my knowledge, your presentation sparked my knowledge of these concepts. So, and I would like to know what other people, if that sparked the same thing in you. And what do Maoris, when they watch this, how much of the cultural stuff do they know and get?
Thank you for your thoughts. I might ask Nahi after I answer what I can from your comments. For me, one of the things that I wanted to convey is, it is a big thing to ask somebody to represent another mythological god, we call them atua, but god. And so not everyone will agree to participate and be an actor in this type of work, because not everyone can do that. One of the things that I've learned through being an artist is our representations of our ancestors come after death, and that's usually as carvings, depictions. And so, and because this work was originally commissioned for the Arts Festival, which has got a very theatrical, theatre as its main emphasis, I wanted to look at masks because there's a history of masks, and of course there's the Grecian masks, but I wanted to see how our masks might look in that kind of, starting to play in that arena. So as the Maori warrior is dying, the carved head goes on the face, and so I'm trying to give these little clues and these little ideas and think about these traditions and how they play out. So that's, various people have said nice things to me, people I know, but that doesn't mean that that's everybody's response. It's interesting to be an artist because generally you'll get some feedback, and it's the people who like it will come and tell you, but maybe the people who don't like it, you might read about it later. So, for no reason. And that's fine too. It's part of everyone's own personal experience. But most of the feedback, people who are filmmakers, they really enjoy it, that space that it opens up for people to really have to work things through, because that's really what I'm trying to do. I'm not as I said before, because I'm not a te reo speaker, I don't feel like I have that language. The language that I have to express what I want to express is visual and oral, and that's what James and I spend a lot of time really trying to get that feeling across, or to put people into a space that they might want to follow up on those ideas themselves. So that's what I'm trying to create. Perhaps that comes from being a teacher for so many years. That's the way that I do it. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else like to share a comment? Noella.
So thank you very much, Lisa. My question, because you really mentioned it, is the notion that there's mana in the room. So it shows in Pacific Hall, and this idea of activation. So there might have been things that were sleeping, but now because of the work, and specifically the notion of death, dying, it may activate things that were sleeping before. So I guess I heard you talk about the steps that you took to protect yourselves and the actors in the filming of it. I'm wondering, is there now, when it's shown in an ethnographic cultural museum context, is there a triggering of a kind of protections, I guess, as it's showing? Because we had the Coup exhibit, and there was that issue of how do you things wake up and the the museum staff were activated in terms of being able to address those issues. So I'm just wondering if there was some kind of thought process about that.
I haven't been privy to the ways that it will work on behalf of the bishop and what steps or protocols are in place to keep that safe. I don't know if that's something that I might like to talk to or not. I'm going to put you on the spot in that way. But certainly in the work that I've done at the Auckland Art Gallery, we've just had with the Walters Prize and where this work was shown, and with an incredible exhibition called the Lindau exhibition, which had a lot of many depictions of our ancestors from all throughout New Zealand. And certainly things did wake up. And I work with a group called Hālau, so we work on the kind of cultural protocols and thinking about the safety within the building itself. So there were a number of things that we put in place that happened in the background, so to speak, not in the public realm, but in the background. And these things come up from time to time. These are things that we live with and know. I know you're shaking, nodding your head. There's sort of so I don't know what the protocols are in this instance, and it's always an interesting part of the process. But certainly there was a whole lot of negotiation that happened behind the scenes. But I was in New Zealand, so I don't know what that might mean because of course you've been a staff member here, so I imagine these various things come to light at different times through different types of activations, and because there's very powerful things in this, well, there's powerful things everywhere, but there's a lot gathered into this space. So I don't know if that's anything that would you like to talk about? Because it'd be interesting, because I don't know either, and I don't know how much you can say.
Kia ora Noel, mō tērā whātai. I quickly said to Marcus, do you want to say something? No, you do. So I'm going to go back a bit earlier before your whātai and respond to the question about reception and a Māori worldview. Like everybody, that worldview is personal, and in Aotearoa at least, you speak on your own behalf. So I want to mahalo you for your whātai about death. Māori artists are the only artists I know who will walk a very fine line with cultural practices and traditions. As Lisa has said, she doesn't come from a lived experience of understanding these things at a very embedded way, if I can put it that way. And so we, and I'm speaking as a curator who worked with artists like Lisa and Brett and a number of the New Zealand artists that are in the biennial, sort of navigating how you present yourself on the world stage as an artist working with cultural material. So, for instance, even if you use a title for your work that comes with a history, you have to take responsibility for all steps of your navigation of making contemporary art. So, in the New Zealand setting, this is a very hot topic. And Lisa is always in the hot seat because of her approaches to making art that are not always received in the manner in which she produces them. What Lisa was talking about in the instance of the Auckland Art Gallery, which is where I worked before I came to Hawaii, It was a hot topic, Tai Whetuki, this piece, because the elders considered that it was very dark, on the dark side of dark. So this is a conversation I had with Marcus, who's the cultural advisor for Bishop Museum, and also it's cultural to tell people that there are things that come with artist ideas. And so that was my responsibility to convey that message to Bishop Museum. It wasn't and it's still not my responsibility for the presumptions of mana or the activations in that conversation. That becomes Marcus's responsibility. So this is how Polynesians navigate these issues. However, the bottom line still remains with the artist. This comes from her. This comes from Lisa's nako. This is her whakaaro. This belongs with her family. And I'll even